In this chapter, we will be focusing on the beginning of the Civil War. You will, in your reading, learn more about and pay attention to the major events, the impact these events had on the conclusion of the war, but you also need to pay attention to the period known as a Reconstruction period after the war. For this purpose, though, we are going to be focusing on what happened and what led up to the war itself. And we are going to be talking about, first of all, the difference between the North and the South. The North being driven by industry, less dependent on slavery, not that they didn't have slavery, and more factory-based, where the South was more of a plantation economy, relying heavily on enslaved labor. This is an economic difference. There are religious differences, there are political differences. We are going to be focusing on a few of these. One of the first issues we see leading up to the war is the issue of slavery. It's an obvious difference between the North and the South. One of the issues is actually not even around the northern and southern colonies, now states, but around the new territories. What to do with slavery when we expand west. California was growing fast because of the gold rush. It had received statehood in 1850, but the big question was raised, would it be a slave or a free state? And at this time, the South had threatened to secede or to withdraw from the Union if they did not get this land. Henry Clay is going to work up a compromise that the North and the South would both like. To please the North, California would be admitted to the Union as a free state. But to please the South, they proposed a new and more effective fugitive slave law, which we'll talk about in the next slide. To please both sides, popular sovereignty started, which was the right to vote for or against slavery for the residents of Utah and the New Mexico territories. It was the idea that now the people had the right to vote, that we weren't going to draw a line and let that determine it. One of the big compromises we see being made is the Fugitive Slave Act. And this act said that fugitive slaves were not entitled to a trial by jury. Anyone convicted were fined $1,000 and imprisoned up to 6 months for harboring or helping a slave. Some Northerners fought against it and forming vigilante committees to send endangered slaves to Canada for safety. One of our most effective ways of fugitive slave was with the Underground Railroad, which was a secret network of people who would be hid and transported across lines into safer areas. A conductor would be someone who hid fugitive slaves. A station would be places to stop along the way. And Harriet Tubman, the woman pictured here, is probably the most famous conductor who escaped for her own freedom and then went back and led over 300 slaves to freedom. You see, they have all kind of a railroad theme as kind of this idea that there's this underground network that people only involved with the Underground Railroad would know about. One of the most famous pieces of literature that comes out of this time that inspires this movement against slavery is Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she relays the life of slaves, and it made and stressed that slavery was not just a political issue, but a moral issue of right and wrong. And as a result, the book stirred Northern abolitionists, those against slavery, to increase their protest against the Fugitive Slave Act. And Southerners thought it was a just direct attack on them and their way of life. Tensions going to increase as the colonists continually decide what to do with the new territory, like Kansas and Nebraska. They decided, like Utah and New Mexico, that they would like to do popular sovereignty. Many people wanted that. The problem was Kansas and Nebraska lay above the 3630 Missouri Compromise line and were legally free to slavery. Of course, the South is not like that. So they passed the Kansas and Nebraska Act, dividing Kansas and Nebraska into 2 areas, and did away with the Missouri Compromise and allowed the states to choose. One of the biggest problems we see with a fugitive slave and do they have rights is the issue of Dred Scott, featured here, who was a former slave whose owner took him to the slave state of Missouri and then to a free territory of Illinois and Wisconsin and then back to Missouri. And Scott appealed to the Supreme Court that because he had lived in the free state that he was then therefore free. And the Supreme Court ruled against Scott because they said he had no legal standing because he was not a citizen. And according to the Fifth Amendment, he was protected property, which included slaves at this time. And Northerners said that this is not only permitted the extension of slavery, but guaranteed it, that no matter where these slaves went, they were never exempt from slavery. To precurse the Civil War, the biggest event that probably led to the succession of the Confederacy and the beginning of the war was the election of Abraham Lincoln. He had pledged to halt the spread of slavery, not necessarily to stop it, but assured Southerners that his administration would not interfere with their slaves or with them about their slaves, but Southerners did not like him. Regardless, when he was showing up on the ballots for the election, many Southern people did not even put him on his ballots. Lincoln actually won less than half the popular vote and no electoral votes from the South. He didn't even appear on the ballots, like was mentioned, because of all the hostility towards him. So when he was elected, it was easy to see that the South would secede. Southerners believed that they had lost their political voice now with Lincoln as president, and South Carolina started the pack and actually seceded from the Union in December of 1860. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all seceded with them, all that you see featured in red. And this began the Confederacy, or a new government started here in the United States. So you have the United States to the north and the Confederacy of the United States to the south. And delegates from the South met in Montgomery, Alabama in 1861 and formed this new Confederate States of America, as you see the flag featured above. They drew up their own constitution with few changes from the original. Most important difference was that it protected and recognized slavery in the new territories. And they elected their Mississippi senator, who featured, you see up here, is Jefferson Davis as president. And that begins the war. From this point on, we will have our first battles that you'll read about, as well as the conclusion of the war. Pay special attention to Gettysburg and Vicksburg and their importance on the war, as well as what happens after. How do they reconstruct the South and the North after a war that has divided a country apart?